Welcome to Midnight Cryptid, where the wilderness keeps its darkest secrets. Every year, thousands of hikers and campers venture into America's remote forests and mountains. Most return home safely. But some encounter things they can't explain. This channel documents their stories, their warnings, encounters with Bigfoot lurking at the edge of firelight, the massive winged figure of Mothman blocking the hiking trail, the unstoppable hunger of the Wendigo in the snow, skinwalkers mimicking familiar voices in the darkness, the Jersey Devil's piercing screams echoing through the pine barrens, the knot deer standing motionless on the trail, watching, and the inexplicable phenomena that defy every rational explanation. These are the accounts of those who survived. If you love cryptid encounters, unexplained wilderness phenomena, and the horrors lurking beyond civilization, subscribe, enable notifications so you never miss a story. Because out there, in the dark forest, something is always watching. Welcome to Midnight Cryptid. Welcome to Midnight Cryptid, where the wilderness keeps its darkest secrets. Before the emails stopped coming and before the search teams gave up, there were 5 of us standing at the trailhead of the North Cascades, trying to decide if we were adventurous or just stupid. Looking back now, I know which one we were. My name is Kevin Perez, and I need you to understand something right from the start. What happened to us wasn't some Hollywood monster story. It wasn't a creature jump scare moment that you see in films. It was far worse because it was real, and it was gradual, and by the time we understood what we were actually dealing with, our phones had already stopped working. The trip was supposed to be straightforward. 5 of us. 7 days in the wilderness of Washington state. We were experienced hikers, or so we told ourselves. I'd done the Pacific Crest Trail section through here twice. Brian Thompson had summited everything worth summiting from Mount Hood to Mount Rainier. Edward Harris had lived in Seattle his entire life and knew these mountains like most people know their own houses. Timothy Clark was the cautious one, always checking weather reports and backup plans. And then there was Ronald Sanchez, who considered himself a nature photographer and spent most of his time trying to capture perfect shots of alpine meadows and pristine lakeside camping spots. The plan was simple. Hike the backcountry route that forms a rough triangle between Glacier Peak, the Cascade Pass Trail, and the high meadows near Sahali Arm. We'd arranged our route to stay at least 2 days' walk from any established facilities or ranger stations. It was supposed to be a test of ourselves against the wilderness, a chance to prove that we could disconnect, push ourselves, and come back changed. That's what Edward had written in the group chat when he planned the whole thing. I should have noticed that Ronald was the only one who really seemed excited about the isolation part. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd expect. Beautiful hiking, the kind of scenery that makes you remember why you fell in love with the Pacific Northwest in the first place. We climbed from the lower elevations where the old-growth Douglas firs give way to that perfect zone where the hemlocks and mountain hemlocks create a canopy so dense that the world below feels like it exists underwater. The light filters through green, and everything smells like damp earth and ancient wood. Our first camp was at a lake called Downey, tucked in a basin that was completely silent except for wind in the trees and the occasional call of a Steller's jay. Tim set up the bear canister. Brian and I collected water from a small creek that fed into the lake. Edward and Ronald photographed the sunset until the light got so blue that our faces turned the color of corpses. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, we climbed higher. We were heading toward the passes, toward the exposed ridgelines where the alpine environment starts, and the trees give up the fight against wind and altitude. The path became steeper, rockier. We lost the hemlocks and started seeing stunted whitebark pines and hardy subalpine fir. The air got thinner and the world got bigger. Ronald kept stopping to photograph everything. A glacier in the distance, a wildflower cluster, the way the light hit a particular valley below us. It slowed us down, but no one complained. Photography breaks were built into the schedule. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Brian first mentioned hearing something. We'd stopped for lunch near a small saddle that looked out across miles of ridgeline. Edward was eating jerky. Tim was refilling water bottles from a snowmelt stream. I was sitting on a rock, looking at my watch and calculating whether we'd make our planned campsite before dark. Ronald was, of course, taking pictures of the valley below. Brian sat down next to me and said, very quietly, "Do you hear that?" I listened. For a long time, I didn't hear anything beyond the normal sounds of the mountain. Wind through the rocks, the distant sound of the stream, the crunch of Edward's footsteps on gravel. "Hear what?" I asked. Something moving, Brian said. In the trees down there. He pointed toward the dense forest about 400 yards below us. Something big. I looked at the trees. They were the color of dark green, almost gray where the shadows fell. I couldn't see any movement. I couldn't hear anything either. Probably a mountain goat, I said. Or a mule deer. There are plenty of them up here. That wasn't how a deer moves, Brian said. He was staring at the trees with the intensity of someone who actually knew how animals moved. Which he did. Brian had worked for Washington State Parks for 5 years before quitting to go into consulting. He knew this state's wildlife better than most people knew their own families. I watched the tree line for another minute. Nothing moved. No sound emerged from the forest except the wind and water. "Let's get moving," Edward called out. He was already shouldering his pack. "We've got at least 3 more miles before dark." We packed up. Ronald reluctantly put away his camera, and we continued on, gaining elevation, moving toward the exposed ridges that we all knew and loved and secretly dreaded a little bit. The kind of places where you feel exposed, where you feel watched by the landscape itself. Nothing else happened that afternoon. By the time we reached our planned camping spot near Cascade Pass, the only thing any of us were thinking about was food and sleep. We set up the tents in the standard configuration, our 2-person tents arranged in a rough semicircle, the bear canister secured about 100 yards away from camp, in the opposite direction from where we collected water. The second night was different from the first. I noticed it around midnight. I'd been asleep for about 2 hours, lying in my sleeping bag in the tent I was sharing with Tim, the kind of sleep where you're deeply unconscious but still aware that you're in a tent and not in a bed. And then something pulled me partially awake. There was a sound, not loud, not alarming by itself, but it was a sound that didn't belong. It was something moving through the rocks around our camp, not the usual sound of wind or falling debris. Something deliberate, something with weight. Tim was awake too. I could hear his breathing had changed from the regular rhythm of sleep to something more alert. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I whispered back. We lay there in silence, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Something moving through the camp perimeter. Something large. "Bear," Tim said, but he didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything. I was reaching for the bear bell I kept in my jacket. Something you're supposed to do if a bear wanders into camp. Make noise. Make yourself seem less like food and more like something loud and annoying. But before I could pull out the bell, the sound stopped. We waited, listening. Nothing. Just wind and the distant sound of the creek feeding into the valley below. Whatever it was, it had moved on. "Probably a raccoon," Tim said quietly. "Or a marten. Something small trying to raid the bear canister." "The canister's 100 yards away," I said. "Maybe it was just exploring the perimeter," Tim said. "Checking out the camp. They do that sometimes." We lay there for another hour, I think. Neither of us slept. But nothing else happened. Eventually, the exhaustion of hiking won out over the alertness of fear, and we drifted back into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, we didn't mention it to the others. We hiked the pass. We photographed the views. Edward made his usual terrible jokes about how we were all getting older and should appreciate the mountains while we could still physically get to them. Ronald took his pictures. Brian seemed quiet, but Brian had been quiet since he mentioned hearing something move in the forest. On the third night, camping at a lake called Mush, we all heard it. We were sitting around the camp stove, eating a rehydrated chili that somehow managed to be both watery and gritty when the sound came. It wasn't subtle this time. It was the sound of something large, something heavy, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore, moving through the trees at the edge of our camp. All 5 of us stopped eating. "What the hell?" Edward said quietly. It was the sound of branches breaking. Not small branches. Not the kind of damage a deer or elk would do. The kind of damage something much, much larger would make. "Bear," Brian said, but with a different tone than Tim had used. Less reassuring, more instructional. "Everyone stand up. Stay calm. We need to make noise." We all stood. Ronald knocked over his food container. I shouted. Tim started hitting the pot with a spoon. The sound moved away from us, crashing through the forest, breaking branches, moving with surprising speed for something so clearly enormous. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound stopped. "Okay," Brian said quietly. "Okay. That was definitely a bear. A big bear. But if we stay calm and keep making noise, it will avoid us." No one believed him. I could see it in their faces. We all knew the difference between a bear and something else, and what we'd heard wasn't a bear. But none of us said that out loud. On the fourth day, we saw tracks. We were breaking down camp at Mush Lake, preparing for another day of hiking. Ronald was photographing the sunrise as usual. Tim and Edward were packing up the shelter. Brian and I were organizing the food and water. Brian found the tracks at the edge of the camp perimeter, in a soft patch of earth near where the small stream fed into the lake. "Kevin," he called quietly, "come look at this." I walked over, and when I saw them I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when you're looking at something you don't want to be looking at. Something that's forcing you to acknowledge that the world is larger and stranger than you'd assumed. The tracks were bipedal, two-legged. The imprints showed what looked like a heel, an arch, and 5 toes. But the foot was enormous. The distance between the heel and the tip of the longest toe was at least 16 inches, maybe more. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Brian said. He was already getting out his phone to take pictures. Then he cursed because his phone had no signal. He borrowed Edward's phone, which also had no signal. None of our phones had signal. They hadn't since we left the trailhead. Edward came over, then Tim, then Ronald, who stopped photographing the sunrise and came to photograph this instead. "Bigfoot," Ronald said simply. "No," Edward said. But his voice didn't carry any conviction. "The stride," Brian said, measuring with his hand. "The foot structure. The depth of the impression. The way the soil is compressed. I've tracked deer my entire life. I've tracked bears. I've tracked mountain lions. This is different. This is something I've never seen before." "It could be a bear," Tim said, but he was looking at the track with the kind of expression you wear when you're trying very hard to believe something you know isn't true. "Bears are plantigrade," Brian said. He was speaking like a teacher now, like he needed to explain this away through information. "They put weight on their whole foot. This is digitigrade. The weight is distributed from the heel through the toe. This is a hominid foot, human-like, but much, much larger." We all stood there, looking at the track. The sun was rising over the lake, turning the water gold. The mountains were magnificent around us, serene and beautiful, and in the soft earth there was a single track of something that shouldn't exist. Ronald was still photographing. "We should pack up and move," he said finally. "Stay in groups. Don't camp here tonight." For once, no one disagreed with Ronald. The day's hike took us higher, away from the lakes and streams and into the alpine zone proper. We climbed toward Cascade Pass and then beyond it, following a route that would eventually loop us back toward the trailhead. The elevation meant fewer trees, more exposed ridgeline, more places where we could see what was around us. I kept thinking about the track, about how enormous that foot must be, about what kind of body that foot would be attached to. The silence on the trail was complete. Usually, when we hiked, there was some conversation, some commentary on the views, jokes about the elevation or the steepness of the path. This day, no one said anything. We hiked in a tight group, no one lagging more than a few feet from the person in front of them. That night, we camped at a place called Sahale Arm, a broad alpine meadow surrounded by peaks. There was no water source at the campsite itself, just the wet ground of the meadow and a small snowfield that was still holding on in early August, even at this elevation. We set up camp in the center of the meadow, as far from any tree line as possible. It was a choice driven by something primal. We didn't discuss it. We just all moved, without speaking, toward the middle of the open space. The bear canister went even further away than usual, dragged out by Tim and Brian to a spot about 100 yards away, in a direction that seemed random until I realized. It was positioned so that anything coming to raid it would have to cross open ground, would have to be visible, would have to approach us from a place where we could see it coming. Night fell early at that elevation. The temperature dropped fast, faster than it should have in August. We huddled in our tents, eating food we'd prepared at the camp stove, as close to the flame as we could get. Around midnight, it came to our camp. I wasn't asleep. None of us were. I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see that footprint. That enormous, perfect footprint of something with 5 toes and a heel and the body structure of a human being. The sound, when it came, was different from before. It wasn't the sound of something moving through the forest. This was the sound of something walking through an open meadow. The sound of something heavy taking deliberate steps across the grass and rock. It circled the camp. I could hear it, even from inside the tent. the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling around us, around the tents, the footsteps never hurrying but never stopping. Tim was frozen next to me. I could feel his entire body rigid with something beyond fear, with the kind of primal alertness that humans feel when they know they are prey. The footsteps continued. They came close to our tent, so close that I could hear the sound of breathing, large, slow, rhythmic breathing. And then, just outside the tent wall, I heard a sound that I've spent the last 3 years trying not to remember. It was a sniff. Not the sniff of a dog or a bear or any animal I could name. It was the deliberate inhalation of something trying to smell us, something that wanted to know what we were made of. Tim's hand found mine. He gripped it with a strength that was almost painful. The breathing continued. The sniffing continued. Outside the thin fabric of the tent, something enormous was standing very close to us, and it was trying to figure out what we were. And then, slowly, the footsteps continued. It moved away from our tent, moved toward the tent where Brian and Edward were sleeping, and we heard the same thing happen again. The stopping, the standing, the breathing, the sniffing. "Don't make a sound," Edward's voice came from the tent. Not a shout, a whisper, but clearly audible in the mountain silence. "Just stay completely still." The footsteps moved again, to the third tent, where Ronald was, and again, the same pattern. The stopping, the standing, the breathing, the testing. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Time was distorted. My sense of duration was shattered by the simple fact that there was something outside the tent. Something that wanted in. Something that was trying to decide if we were worth bothering with. And then, gradually, the footsteps moved away, not running, not alarmed, just moving away from the tents, toward the edge of the meadow, toward the tree line that marked the boundary of the open space. But before it reached the trees, it made a sound. It was a vocalization, not a roar, not a scream. Something between a howl and a bellow, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from deep in the chest of whatever was making it. The sound was so loud that I felt it vibrate the tent. I felt it vibrate my bones, and then it was gone. The sound ended. The footsteps stopped. The thing that had been in our camp vanished into the darkness. We didn't leave the tents that night. We didn't turn on flashlights. We didn't speak. We just lay there, in the absolute darkness, listening to the mountain and the wind and our own terrified breathing. When the sun rose, everything was quiet again. The meadow was empty, serene, beautiful. There was no sign that anything had happened except for the tracks. The tracks were everywhere. They came from the tree line, entered the meadow, circled each of our tents in a wide path, and then returned to the tree line. The footprints were the same as the one Brian had found at Mush Lake, 16 inches long, perfect bipedal structure, 5 toes, a heel. Something designed to walk upright, designed to be intelligent, designed to be something that understood what camping equipment was and what humans were. On the 5th day, we made the decision to leave. There was a moment, just after dawn, where we sat together by the camp stove and looked at each other and didn't need to discuss it. We all understood that our 7-day trip was over. We understood that whatever had visited our camp the night before was aware of us, was tracking us, and was intelligent enough to circle our tents deliberately, studying us, learning about us. Edward said, "We hike fast today. We get to the trailhead. We report this to the rangers. We let the professionals handle it." No one asked what professionals he thought would handle it. We all knew that what we were describing was impossible, a creature that didn't officially exist. A creature that was, by any reasonable standard, a myth, a fantasy, something that people argued about on internet forums but that no one with actual evidence had ever documented. We packed in silence. We burned all the trash. We took down the tents. We secured the bear canister. We did all the things you're supposed to do to leave a camp better than you found it. And then we started hiking. The route was direct, straight down the mountain, the most direct path to the trailhead. We moved fast, faster than we usually moved. No breaks, no photography, no stopping to admire the views. We just hiked. By midday, we'd lost the alpine environment and were back in the trees. The forest of the Cascades is beautiful, but up close, moving through it at speed, it becomes something different. It becomes a maze, an endless corridor of trunks and branches and shadows, a place where visibility drops from miles to just a few feet. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we noticed that we were being followed. We didn't see it. No one got a clear visual of it moving through the forest. But we could hear it, moving parallel to us, keeping pace with us, always just far enough away that we couldn't see it clearly, but close enough that we could hear it, moving through the undergrowth. "Just keep moving," Brian said when someone mentioned it. We didn't stop. We didn't look for it. We just kept hiking and listening to the sound of something large moving through the forest alongside us. After maybe an hour of this, Tim said, "It's not hunting us." "What?" Edward asked. "It's not hunting us," Tim repeated. "If it was hunting us, it would attack. It would be aggressive. This is something else. This is something curious. This is something that wants to know what we are, what we're doing, where we're going." "That's not any better," Ronald said. He was breathing hard. His usually immaculate hiking outfit was torn in several places, and sweat was running down his face in streaks that mixed with dust. "It's actually more unsettling," Brian said. "A predator follows its prey for a reason. It's going to eat. But this is observation. This is something with intelligence. Something that's actively curious." We kept moving. The sun started to descend, and the forest got darker. We'd made good time, maybe 12 or 13 miles, but we still had another 7 or 8 miles to reach the trailhead. By the time real darkness fell, we knew we'd have to camp again. No one wanted to camp again. The decision was made without discussion. We'd push through the night. We'd hike in darkness, using our headlamps, and we'd reach the trailhead by morning. It would be dangerous. It would be exhausting, but it seemed like the better option. Around 6 in the evening, we stopped just long enough to eat some trail food, bars, dried fruit, nuts. Nothing that required cooking, nothing that required a camp, and while we ate, the thing in the forest stopped moving parallel to us. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of it following us had been. "Where did it go?" Ronald asked. No one answered, because no one knew, and more importantly, because we all realized what the silence meant. It had stopped following us on a specific route. It had stopped moving in a pattern that was dependent on our movement. The only reason it would stop was if it was no longer trying to follow us. And the only reason it would stop trying to follow us was if it was no longer following our trail to the trailhead, which meant it knew where we were going, which meant it knew something about us that we hadn't told it. We started hiking in darkness, headlamp beams cutting through the black forest, our pace accelerating to something that was almost reckless. Hiking through difficult terrain in the dark is dangerous. You can easily twist an ankle on a route, can fall, can get lost. But we were more afraid of being in that forest at night, alone, with that thing knowing where we were heading. The hike became a blur. Hours of walking, the sound of our boots on the forest floor, the occasional sound of branches snapping around us. Once, something large moved across the trail maybe 50 yards ahead of us, and our headlamps caught the reflection of something massive, something dark, something that was definitely not a deer or an elk. We didn't stop. We just kept moving. It was around 3 in the morning when Brian suddenly stopped on the trail and said, My phone has signal." We all stopped. We all looked at our phones, and incredibly, unbelievably, we had signal again. Weak signal. 1 bar. But signal. Edward was already dialing. The ranger station. The emergency line. He spoke quickly, told them where we were, told them that we'd seen something unusual in the backcountry, something that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. He didn't mention Bigfoot. He was smart enough not to sound insane on a recording that would probably be kept forever. "They're sending a ranger to meet us at the trailhead," Edward said once he hung up. "He's going to be there by sunrise." The relief we all felt was immediate and almost physical. We had 30 minutes of hiking left, and we had official help coming to meet us. Whatever had been following us, whatever had visited our camps, whatever had made that sound in the darkness of the meadow, it suddenly seemed less important than getting to the trailhead and explaining everything to someone who represented civilization and order and the rational world. We were wrong about that. The last part of the trail is straightforward, a clear path, easy to follow, even in the dark. We hiked it quickly. Our headlamps shone on the familiar markers, the trail signs, the bridge across the creek that marked the end of the backcountry section. We could see the parking area, the ranger station entrance, lights, civilization, and then, from the darkness behind us, we heard the howl, the same sound we'd heard at Sahale Arm, that resonant, deep bellow that seemed to come from something ancient and enormous. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the ridges and mountains, and it didn't sound like it was 50 yards behind us anymore. It sounded like it was everywhere. We ran. All 5 of us, completely abandoning caution, ran the last 100 yards of the trail into the parking area. The ranger's truck was just pulling in, and the light of the headlamps caught us as we burst out of the forest, still running, still expecting something to emerge from the darkness behind us. "Whoa, whoa," the ranger said, his hand already on his radio. "What happened? Are you hurt?" We weren't hurt, but we were destroyed in a different way. We were terrified in a way that didn't have a name. We were marked by the knowledge that something had seen us, had followed us, had stalked us through the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, and had let us escape, and we had no proof. The ranger took us to the station. He gave us water. He made us sit down and tell him everything that had happened over the last 3 days. We told him about the sounds in the camp. We told him about the tracks at Mush Lake. We told him about the night in Sahali Arm Meadow when something had circled our tents. We told him about being followed through the forest. We told him about the sound at the end. We didn't mention Bigfoot. We let him draw his own conclusions. His conclusion was that we'd been followed by a black bear that was larger than usual, and that the stress of the situation had made us interpret normal animal behavior as something more sinister. "It's common," he said. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, and he had the tone of someone who'd been explaining away backcountry reports for 30 years. Fear does things to perception. You hear a branch break, and your mind turns it into a footstep. You see a shadow, and it becomes something larger. Bears are curious, intelligent. A large bear following a group of hikers isn't unusual. Brian started to say something about the tracks, about the size of them, about the bipedal structure. But the ranger held up his hand. "I'll send a crew out to Sahali Arm in a few days to check on the camp in the area. If there's evidence of something unusual, we'll find it. But I want to tell you something. Based on 40 years of working with wildlife in this state, what you saw was a bear, or maybe multiple bears. Your minds did the rest." We didn't argue further. We were exhausted, we were traumatized, and we had already realized something that the ranger hadn't considered. No one would believe us if we said anything else. We'd come out of the wilderness with an impossible story. The only way to make it less impossible was to agree with the ranger's explanation and pretend that we actually believed it. The ranger's crew went out to Sahali Arm 3 days later. They found our camp, more or less intact. They found traces of the bear canister we'd left behind. They found no tracks. They found no evidence of anything larger than a mule deer in the area. They reported this officially, and the whole situation was closed. As far as the official record is concerned, 5 hikers had a bad experience with a black bear in the North Cascades, and they got scared for no reason. But I need to tell you what actually happened next, because this is the part that I haven't told anyone. This is the part that keeps me awake at night. 2 weeks after we got out of the forest, Brian Thompson stopped going to work. His colleagues at the consulting firm got worried and did a welfare check at his apartment. He was there, but he wasn't responsive. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The paramedics took him to the hospital. The diagnosis was a complete psychological breakdown, severe PTSD, acute dissociation. The psychiatrist tried to explain it as a delayed stress response from the trip, a way his mind had protected itself by retreating entirely. He's still in a facility. He hasn't spoken in almost 3 years. Edward Harris tried to go about his life like nothing had happened. He went back to work. He went to social events. He posted pictures of mountains on Instagram like they were still his favorite places in the world. But 6 months after we got out, he quit his job and moved to the East Coast. I saw on Facebook that he's now living in Pennsylvania, working in IT for some pharmaceutical company. He never hikes anymore. He hasn't been back to Washington. Timothy Clark did something stranger. He became obsessed with researching the history of the Pacific Northwest, Native American folklore, historical accounts of wilderness encounters, reports filed with wildlife agencies. He spent hours in the library and on the internet, documenting everything he could find about sightings of large bipedal creatures in the Cascade Range. He has notebooks, hundreds of pages of notes. He wanted to know if anyone else had seen what we'd seen. He wanted to know if there was a pattern. There was a pattern. Going back 70 years in the written record, there are accounts. A hiking group in 1952 reported being followed through the forest for 2 days. A wildlife researcher in 1973 reported finding enormous footprints near Glacier Peak. A park ranger in 1985 wrote in a personal journal, which was made public after his death, about the feeling of being observed by something intelligent while he was alone in the high country. A photographer in 1991 mentioned in an interview that something had entered his camp at night, and he'd been afraid to move until dawn. These reports exist, not in official channels, not in official databases, but in personal journals, in interviews, in conversations that were documented by people who believed what they were saying. Ronald Sanchez, the photographer among us, tried to use the experience. He went back to the Cascades twice over the next year, trying to photograph what we'd seen. The first time he came back with nothing. The second time he came back with a single photograph. It was taken at Sahali Arm, near where we'd camped. It was taken at dusk, in that golden light before real darkness falls, and in the background, just barely visible, just at the edge of the light, there was a shape, a silhouette of something enormous and upright, standing at the tree line. He showed it to me and said, "I think it let me photograph it. I think it knew what I was doing, and it let me get one picture." I asked him why he didn't publish it, why he didn't submit it to wildlife magazines or cryptozoology research groups. He said, "Because if I do, people will come, researchers will come, hikers will come, equipment companies will come, and whatever is living in those mountains will have to leave or change its behavior to accommodate human presence, and I don't think I can justify doing that. I don't think I have the right to expose it." As for me, I became a researcher, not in any official capacity, but in every capacity that mattered. I read everything I could about the Pacific Northwest wilderness and its wildlife. I studied animal behavior. I learned about black bears and grizzlies and mountain lions and every large predator that exists in North America. I did this because I needed to understand the context of what we'd experienced. I needed to know if there was any possible way that what we'd encountered could be explained by known wildlife. And the more I learned, the more certain I became that nothing could explain it. No bear is bipedal. No bear has a foot structure like what we saw. No bear walks upright and circles a camp to study it. No bear is intelligent enough to understand the concept of a tent and to wonder about the humans inside it. What we encountered in those mountains was something else. Something that has lived in the high country of the Cascades for longer than humans have been in the Pacific Northwest. Something that is smart enough to be curious about humans but smart enough to avoid interaction. Something that, in 3 days, evaluated us, tested us, and decided that we were worth letting escape. The last thing I want to tell you is the dream. I have the dream regularly. In the dream, I'm back in the tent at Sahali Arm. I'm lying in my sleeping bag, and I can hear the breathing outside. I can hear the sniffing. And then, slowly, a face appears. Not a human face, not exactly an ape face. Something between. Something with deep-set eyes that are looking directly at me. Something that is trying to understand what I am. And in the dream, I realize something. I realize that it's not trying to harm me. It's not trying to hunt me. It's asking me a question. It's asking me what I'm doing in its home. What humans are doing, pushing further and further into the wild, taking our equipment and our lights and our noise deeper into the places that don't belong to us. And I never have an answer for it. I never know what to say. When I wake up from the dream, I understand that I'm not afraid of what we saw anymore. I'm afraid that we're going to find it. That one day, someone will get proof. Someone will get a photograph that can't be disputed. Someone will get a specimen. Someone will capture it or kill it or study it. And when that happens, the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest will have lost something that it can never get back. Something ancient. Something that should have remained hidden. Sometimes I wonder if the thing that visited our camp knew this too. If it understood, in its intelligence, that letting us go was the kindest thing it could do for everyone involved. That some truths are better left in the darkness. That some mysteries deserve to stay mysteries. I don't know, but I know that I will never go back to those mountains. I know that I will never hike into the backcountry of the Cascades again. And I know that 3 times a year, when the weather is right and the season is turning, I still hear the sound of that howl in my dreams. That low, resonant bellow that carried through the darkness and reminded us, in a way that nothing else could have, that the world is much larger than we've been taught, and much stranger, and that there are still places where humans are not the dominant intelligence. There are still wild places, and maybe they should stay that way. I never believed in mountain curses, not before that week in October. not before I saw what waited for us in the ancient forests of eastern Kentucky, where the ridgelines stretch like broken teeth and the mist never quite lifts from the hollows. My name is Nicholas Allen, and I need to tell someone what happened because the official report says we were lucky. 8 men went into the Appalachian wilderness. 8 men came out, but luck had nothing to do with our survival. We were hiking enthusiasts, the kind of people who checked weather reports obsessively and carried satellite phones we'd never actually use. Eric King organized the trip. He'd been researching the Black Mountain Range for 3 years, mapping out what he called the authentic Appalachian experience, minus the actual danger. We booked a private guide named Stephen Wright, a local who'd lived in the mountains his entire life and claimed to know every trail, every stream, every rocky outcrop worth photographing. The rest of us were friends from college who gathered annually for what we called the expedition. Jonathan Scott was our group's optimist, the one who made terrible jokes when things got tense. Larry Torres kept a detailed journal of every hike, every elevation change, every species of bird we spotted. Justin Wynn handled our equipment and supplies with military precision. Scott Hill was our physical challenge specialist, the guy who pushed us to go higher, faster, farther than we'd gone the previous year. Brandon Flores was the quiet one, the photographer who barely spoke but captured everything. October 15th, we arrived at the base camp near Harlan County, Kentucky. The mountains were turning colors, gold and orange and deep crimson bleeding through the evergreen. It was genuinely beautiful, the kind of place that makes you understand why people write songs about Appalachia. Stephen met us at the ranger station at dawn on the 16th, and the first thing I noticed was his reluctance. "You boys know where you're going?" he asked, studying our maps. "Black Mountain Loop," Eric said. "We've got the permits. 5 days, 4 nights, nothing extreme." Stephen was quiet for a long moment. He was in his 60s, weathered the way mountain people are weathered, like the land itself had sculpted his face. He had the kind of eyes that had seen things most people don't see. "That's fine country," he finally said. "But there's parts of those hollows I don't recommend going into after dark. Won't charge you extra to stay higher up, on the exposed ridgelines where there's still light longer." "What's the danger?" Brandon asked. "Predators?" "Nothing official," Stephen said, and that phrase stayed with me. Nothing official. Like the unofficial things were the ones worth worrying about. But we were young and skeptical, and we'd paid for this hike months in advance. We had new equipment. We had plans. So we assured Stephen we'd be fine, and at 7 in the morning, we started climbing. The first day was perfect, genuinely perfect. We climbed for 6 hours, taking breaks every 90 minutes, staying hydrated, consulting our maps and GPS units. Stephen led us up the southeastern ridge of Black Mountain, and the views kept getting better. By afternoon, we could see 3 states from our position. Jonathan kept cracking jokes about being on top of the world. We were having the time of our lives. We made camp at 5,800 feet in a clearing with a natural water source. Stephen helped us set up the tents while we established a perimeter and prepared dinner. He was quiet throughout, and I caught him studying the tree line at dusk with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or something else. "Tomorrow we head down into the valley trails," he said that evening while we were eating. "We'll cross through some old-growth forest, some of the oldest trees in the eastern United States. Beautiful country. You'll understand why I love these mountains." "What's the elevation drop?" Justin asked. "We'll descend about 2,000 feet over the course of the day, then camp in the lower hollers. There's a shelter there, an old hunting cabin that belongs to the Park Service, much more comfortable than camping." That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't discomfort. It wasn't the altitude or the sounds of the forest. Something else kept me awake, some instinctual awareness that we were being watched. I stayed in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening to the wind in the upper branches of the surrounding trees. It was probably just the altitude messing with my head. We started the descent at 7 in the morning. Stephen led us off the exposed ridgeline into a narrow pass between 2 mountains. The trees immediately got larger and larger. Some of these hemlocks and chestnuts were 300 years old, maybe older. The canopy grew so dense that even at midday, we hiked in a kind of perpetual twilight. Our flashlights were barely necessary, but the shadows created in that dimness were deep and complex. Eric was taking measurements, trying to gauge the age of the largest trees. We'd fallen into a loose formation with Stephen in the lead, Jonathan and Scott Hill in the middle, and the rest of us spread out behind them. The forest floor was soft with centuries of accumulated needles and leaves. It was like walking on a cushion. That's when Brandon stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all went quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant sound of wind and the rustle of our own movement. "What?" Eric asked. "Something large," Brandon said, moving parallel to us, through the undergrowth, about 40 yards to the east. Justin squinted into the dense forest. Probably a deer, maybe an elk, but Stephen was already alert, already changing his posture. He raised a hand, signaling us to stop walking. "Everybody stay calm," he said. "Just keep moving slowly. Don't make sudden movements." "What is it?" I asked. "Probably nothing," Stephen said, and again I caught that phrase. Probably nothing, as opposed to probably something. We kept walking, but slower now, more carefully. The sound moved alongside us for about 20 minutes, always keeping roughly the same distance. It was large enough that we could hear it, heavy enough that branches cracked under its weight, but it never showed itself. After about an hour, the sound stopped. We reached the hunting cabin in late afternoon. It was more substantial than I expected, built from local timber, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was surprisingly clean, with 2 bunks and a table and a wood stove for heating. We dropped our packs with relief. "We'll stay here tonight," Stephen said. "Tomorrow we complete the loop and start heading back up to the ridge camp, then out the following day." That evening, Stephen seemed on edge. He kept stepping outside, looking at the darkening tree line. The sun set around 7, and darkness fell fast, absolute, the way it does when you're surrounded by mountains and dense forest. Our flashlights felt inadequate against that darkness. Around midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and couldn't quite identify. Not quite a scream, not quite a roar. Something that seemed to sit uncomfortably between animal sound and almost human vocalization. It came from somewhere in the forest, maybe 300 yards from the cabin. It lasted about 5 seconds, and then the forest went completely silent. I heard Eric sit up in his bunk. Heard Jonathan whisper something in the darkness. Through the window I could see the others emerging from their tents, flashlights starting to click on. Stephen was already outside when we stumbled out of the cabin. "Everyone inside," he said, and his voice was sharp, authoritative in a way we hadn't heard from him before. "Now, everyone inside. And nobody looks out the windows." "What was that?" Scott Hill demanded. "Inside," Stephen repeated. "We're staying in the cabin tonight, all of us. Nobody goes outside for any reason until sunrise. I need your word on that." Something in his tone made us obey without further argument. We packed what we could and brought it inside. The cabin had 1 door and relatively small windows. We locked the door from inside and built up the fire in the stone stove, more for psychological comfort than actual warmth. For the next 5 hours, we heard sounds outside, not constant, but intermittent. The sound of something large moving through the forest, circling the cabin, the snap of trees. Once, something that might have been breathing, heavy and rhythmic, just beyond the window. Eric tried to get Stephen to explain, but our guide refused to say anything beyond, "Stay quiet, stay inside, it will leave when dawn comes." "What will leave?" Jonathan pressed. Stephen didn't answer. By 4 in the morning, the sounds had stopped. By 5, we could see the first hints of gray in the eastern sky. By 6, the forest around the cabin looked normal again, peaceful, like nothing had happened. We packed up immediately. Stephen wouldn't let us stay for breakfast, wouldn't let us rest. He just said, "We need to move. We need to get higher." As we were leaving, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were deep gouges in the wooden frame of the cabin window, raw wood exposed where something had torn into it from the outside. Multiple gouges, parallel lines, deep and powerful. They looked like they were made by claws. We hiked hard the entire next day, barely stopping to rest or eat. Stephen kept pushing us forward, and we followed without complaint. I could tell from the expressions on the faces of the others that they'd seen the gouges too, and none of us wanted to be in those lower forests again. By evening, we'd regained most of the elevation we'd lost. Stephen set up camp on a high ridge overlooking a massive valley, the kind of view that would normally have been spectacular. We were all too tired and too unnerved to enjoy it. That night, Stephen finally talked. We were sitting around our camp stove, eating a quiet dinner, when he said, "I need to tell you what's been following us." Everyone immediately stopped eating. "There's something that lives in these mountains," Stephen continued. "It's been here a long time. Longer than the logging companies, longer than the coal mines, longer than the settlers. The local people, the ones whose families have been in these hollows for centuries, they have stories, old stories. What kind of stories? Larry asked, his hand drifting toward his journal like he was about to start writing. Stories about a creature. They call it different things. The wampus cat, the booger, the devil cat. It's part of the land here. It's not something I can explain to you in a way that makes sense to people from outside. But it's real, and it knows these mountains in ways that nothing else does. And sometimes, when a group of people comes through, it takes notice. You're saying a mountain lion followed us, Justin said skeptically. A large cat. That's actually not that unusual. They've been making a comeback in the Appalachians. A mountain lion, Stephen said, and I heard something in his voice that might have been sadness or resignation, would show itself eventually, would hunt openly. This isn't a lion. I've seen lions. I've tracked lions. This is something else. What did we hear last night? Brandon asked quietly. That sound? I've only heard it once before, 20 years ago. It's not an animal sound most people recognize. It's old. It doesn't fit into any natural history we've got in our textbooks. This is insane, Scott Hill said. We're talking about a creature from local folklore like it's real. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Stephen replied. I'm telling you what I know, what I've seen, what I've learned from people who've lived their entire lives in these mountains. Last night was a warning. It could smell us. It wanted to know what we were. And if we go back into those lower forests, it will do more than circle the cabin. Eric was studying Stephen with narrowed eyes. You knew this could happen. That's why you tried to keep us on the ridgelines. I knew the risk was higher in the lower hollers, yes. There are places up here too, but less likely to encounter anything. The creature prefers the darkness and the dense growth, the old forests. And if we'd insisted on staying in the hunting cabin? I asked. Stephen was quiet for a long moment. Then we would probably all be dead right now. The thing that came to that cabin last night was curious. If it had decided we were threats or prey, we wouldn't have survived. Nobody slept well that night. We took shifts, even though Stephen said it wouldn't matter. If something wanted to get us up on the ridge, nothing we could do would stop it. But the psychological comfort of having someone awake, watching, was worth it. The following day was October 19th, and it was supposed to be our last full day in the mountains before we hiked out on the 20th. Stephen suggested we could head to the northeast side of Black Mountain, a trail that stayed high, stayed exposed, stayed away from the deep hollows. The creature ranges across the entire mountain system, he said, but it spends most of its time in the old-growth forests, the places where the darkness is deepest. Higher up, more exposed, we're safer. We agreed without debate. Nobody wanted another encounter, or whatever last night had been. We were halfway through the day, following a narrow ridge trail with 1,000-foot drop-offs on both sides, when Eric noticed we were being followed. Not subtly followed. This thing wasn't even trying to hide anymore. It was on the southern slope, 300 yards back, moving through the sparse undergrowth with a kind of terrifying grace. I first saw it when Brandon pointed it out, and the moment I did, I understood why Stephen had been afraid. It looked like a cougar, or at least, it started as a cougar. It had the basic form, the powerful shoulders, the long tail, but nothing about it looked quite right. The proportions were off. The way it moved was off, and when the sunlight hit it at certain angles, I could swear the thing was larger than it had been a moment before. Don't stop walking, Stephen said quietly. Keep moving at the same pace. Don't look at it. Just keep walking toward higher ground. We can see it right there, Jonathan said, his voice strained. I know. Don't acknowledge it. Don't engage with it. Just keep walking. We did, and the creature kept pace with us, sometimes closer, sometimes dropping back. It never approached the trail we were on. It stayed at a distance, always visible, always aware of us. It took me 3 hours of hiking to realize that the creature was hurting us. It wasn't attacking because it was keeping us moving, keeping us going in a specific direction. We were heading out. By late afternoon, we crested a ridge and could see the access road about 2 miles away. The creature stopped. It stood on a rocky outcrop on the slope behind us, silhouetted against the gray sky. Then it turned, and I watched as it descended back into the darker forest below. It's done, Stephen said. It's let us go. Let us go? Eric's voice was shaking. You make it sound like we were prisoners. In a manner of speaking, we were. As long as we were in the deep parts, the old-growth forests, we were in its domain. It doesn't kill without reason, but it doesn't tolerate intrusion either. It took notice of us, it tested us, and then it decided we were worth letting leave alive. We reached the access road just as dusk was falling. There was a parking area with a ranger station about a mile up the road. We walked it in silence. By 8 that evening, we were back in the ranger station, and Stephen was making calls. The rangers who came to meet us were professional but skeptical. They took our statements, asked if we'd encountered wildlife, checked us over for injuries. We told them about the animal following us, and they nodded like it was routine, mentioned mountain lions expanding their range, recommended we file the proper wildlife report. Nobody mentioned the gouges in the cabin window. Stephen had never told us to keep quiet about what happened, but somehow we all understood that nobody would believe us anyway. And more than that, something in us understood that what happened in those mountains belonged to those mountains. Telling the full truth would feel like a violation. It's been 4 months since we left the Appalachian Mountains, 4 months of trying to process what happened and trying to convince ourselves that there are reasonable explanations for everything we experienced. Mountain lion. That's what we tell people. An unusually large mountain lion that was displaying territorial behavior. That's the official story, and most people accept it easily enough. We're lucky, they tell us. Lucky it didn't attack. Lucky we were experienced hikers who knew to stay calm and keep moving. But I know what we saw, and I know that mountain lion doesn't explain it. Eric has been compiling our observations, trying to find documented cases of unusual predator behavior in the Appalachian Mountains. He found historical accounts, journals from settlers dating back to the 1700s and 1800s, that mentioned something they called the wampus beast. A creature too large to be a cougar, with behavior that was almost intelligent, almost purposeful. Some accounts described it as having an almost human awareness. Others mentioned that it seemed to be testing people, evaluating them, deciding whether to kill or let live. The most detailed account came from a 1847 journal written by a farmer named Thomas Wickford. He described witnessing the creature stalk a group of Cherokee hunters for 3 days. The hunters had been hunting bear in the lower hollers, and the creature had driven them into the higher elevations, kept them moving, and finally released them at the mountain passes. Wickford wrote that one of the Cherokee hunters told him the creature was protecting its territory, that it didn't fear men because men were newcomers to the land, but it didn't kill them because it could communicate with them on some level, that the creature was telling them to leave and not return. It sounds insane, Eric said when he showed me the transcription. But what if it's not? What if the creature is territorial, intelligent in a way we don't have a framework for, and essentially non-lethal as long as you're willing to leave? Why are you spending so much time on this? I asked him. Why does it matter if we can explain what it was? We got out alive. Because something inside me knows we just walked through something that doesn't fit in our understanding of the world, Eric said. And I need to know if I'm losing my mind or if something genuinely impossible exists in those mountains. Jonathan went back to normal. He doesn't like talking about what happened, and he definitely doesn't want to hear any theories about mysterious creatures or intelligent predators. He's convinced himself it was a cougar, a large one, and he's content with that explanation. He's already planning next year's expedition. Somewhere else. Definitely not the Appalachians. Larry's journal has been strangely affected. He records everything with his usual precision, but when he writes about what we saw on that ridge, about the sounds we heard, the description becomes almost poetic. He writes about the creature like he's trying to find words that capture something beyond the purely physical. Justin threw himself into work. He's a project manager for a construction firm, and he's been working 60-hour weeks since we got back. I think he's trying to forget. I don't blame him. Scott Hill swears he didn't see what the rest of us saw. He was in the middle of the group when the creature was following us on the ridge, and he insists that what we were looking at was just a mountain lion in strange lighting, and the fact that we're all still talking about it is feeding some kind of shared delusion. Brandon hasn't said much of anything. He quit his photography job last month and moved to Portland. Before he left, he gave me a flash drive with some of the photographs he'd taken in the mountains. Most of them are beautiful wilderness shots, standard nature photography. But there are 3 photographs taken on the ridge that 3rd day. They're blurry, poorly framed, but unmistakable. The creature is clearly visible in all 3, and it's enormous. The photos don't look doctored, but looking at them creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. The animal in the photos is too large to be real. Stephen never made contact with us after the hike ended. I tried to call him a few times, but the number was disconnected. Eric went to the ranger station to see if they could provide another contact, but they told us Stephen had moved away about a month after our hike, left the state. The rangers said he'd been acting strangely, becoming increasingly reclusive, finally just packing up and leaving. I didn't blame him. He'd seen that creature before. He knew what it was capable of. And he'd made a choice to guide tourists into the mountains where this thing lived because he believed, probably, that most groups wouldn't encounter it. That most groups could do their hike without consequence. But we'd encountered it, and whatever Stephen had experienced in those 20 years since his last sighting had caught up with him. 6 weeks ago, Eric found something that changed how I thought about this entire experience. He was going through old geological surveys of the Black Mountain Range, and he discovered a study done in 1989 by a university research team investigating predator behavior in the Appalachian Mountains. The study wasn't particularly notable, but there was a note in the metadata. The research team had been forced to abandon their field work early because, quote, multiple team members reported anomalous wildlife behavior inconsistent with documented predator species and potential risk to personnel. Eric was able to find the names of the researchers, and he tracked down one of them, a wildlife specialist named David Chen, who's now retired in Colorado. They spoke on the phone, and when Eric asked him directly about the 1,989 research, Chen was silent for a long moment before saying, "That was a long time ago. I don't talk about that project. There's something in those mountains," Eric pressed. "Something that the official reports don't mention. Something that made your team leave." Another pause. Then Chen said, "Yes, there is, and you should never go back there. Don't try to research it. Don't try to prove it exists. Don't try to convince other people that it's real. Leave it alone. It's better that way. It's better for everyone." After that conversation, Eric stopped researching. He still has all the materials, still keeps the journal, but he's stopped looking for answers. I think he realized that knowing too much, trying too hard to explain what we saw, might be a violation of something we don't fully understand. Last month, I had a dream about the creature. In the dream, I was standing alone on a ridge, and the sun was setting, and the creature emerged from the forest below. It walked toward me slowly, and when it reached me, it looked directly at me with eyes that were absolutely full of intelligence and purpose. It didn't attack. It just stood there. And I understood somehow that it was telling me something, that it was communicating something I needed to know. When I woke up, I was sweating, and I had this overwhelming sense of being observed, not threatened, just watched. Like something was aware of me, somewhere far away, and knew that I was remembering what had happened in the mountains. I haven't had the dream again, but I haven't forgotten it either. The reason I'm writing this now, after 4 months, is because I received a letter. It arrived at my house, unmarked envelope, no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten, dated February 14th. The letter was from Stephen Wright. "Nicholas," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I've decided to tell you the truth about what happened in the mountains, or it means something has happened to me and someone found this among my belongings. Either way, I need to explain what you encountered, because I don't think any of you understood, and I think some of you need to know. The creature you saw is not a predator, not in the way modern predators are predators. It's a guardian. It's been the guardian of the Black Mountain Range and the surrounding hollers for longer than anyone can accurately measure. The Cherokee had a word for it, and so did the Shawnee and the Adena before them. The settlers had names for it too, though they tried to forget about it, tried to convince themselves it was just an animal they didn't quite understand. When I was a boy, maybe 12 years old, my grandfather took me deep into the forests to teach me the way of the land. We encountered the creature then, though we didn't see it directly. We felt its presence, and we understood that we needed to leave that particular forest. My grandfather told me something I've held on to my entire life. That land is not ours. We live here only because it lets us live here. We take only what it allows us to take, and we respect the guardian that keeps the balance. I've spent 40 years honoring that principle. I've hiked in those mountains thousands of times, and I've only seen the creature twice. Once when I was a young man, and once, recently, after your group left. That second time was different. The creature came to me, and I think it was checking on me, making sure I was all right. It looked at me the way it looked at you on that ridge, with that terrible awareness. And I understood then that it had let your group go not because it was uninterested in you, but because it had made a decision about what kind of people you were, whether you were the kind of people worth letting live. I don't know what criteria it uses for that decision. I don't think anyone does, or anyone ever will. But it made a choice, and you're alive because of it. After you left, I started to feel something changing in the way the mountains spoke to me. I'd lived there my whole life, and for the first time, I felt like an intruder. Like the land was telling me it was time to move on. Like I'd served my purpose as a guide and protector of that place, and now it was time for me to leave. I'm writing this because I believe you should know that what happened to you was not random. The creature was testing you. Testing to see if you were capable of understanding that there are places in this world that don't belong to human beings, that belong to something older and more fundamental. Testing to see if you would tell the truth or hide from it. 3 of you chose to hide. 3 of you chose to process it and move forward. And 1 of you, I think, chose to understand that you'd witnessed something that changed the way you see the world. I hope that understanding brings you peace rather than fear. I hope that when you remember those days in the mountains, you remember not with terror but with respect. That you understand that you were briefly allowed into a place of great power and great mystery, and that you were allowed to leave intact. I'm leaving the mountains now. I don't know where I'll go, but I know I need to go somewhere else. The land has decided I've served long enough. I've accepted that decision. If any of you return to the Appalachian Mountains, return with respect and understanding. Return knowing that you are guests, that every step you take is permitted, that every breath of mountain air is a gift. Return knowing that there are things in those wild places that will always be watching, always be evaluating, always be deciding whether you deserve to survive your encounter with them. And if you choose not to return, that's a valid choice too. Some people are meant to carry the memory of encountering the ancient world. Others are meant to live their lives in the modern one, only dimly aware that there are still wild places that belong to no one and everyone. I can't tell you what I truly believe happened, but I can tell you that it was real, and it will never be adequately explained, and that's exactly how it should be. Stay safe, Nicholas, and if you ever feel late at night like something is watching you and waiting to see what you do next, remember that it's not malevolent, it's just aware. Stephen, I read that letter 6 times the first day I received it. I've read it probably 40 times since then. The thing about that letter is that it doesn't provide closure. It doesn't explain what the creature is or where it came from or what it truly wants. It just confirms that everything we experienced was real, and that something about our experience was cosmically significant in a way we'll never fully understand. I've never found Stephen. Eric tried once more, looking for forwarding addresses, but Stephen Wright effectively disappeared, leaving behind only a letter and the knowledge that he'd voluntarily removed himself from the place that had defined his entire life. That knowledge sits with me differently than the memory of the creature itself, because here's what I finally understand. The thing in those mountains wasn't the unusual part. The unusual part was that Stephen spent 40 years living in a place where an impossible thing existed, and he maintained his sanity, his humanity, his sense of purpose. He guided people safely into danger. He respected the boundary between human territory and ancient territory. He lived in balance with something most people would completely lose their minds encountering, and he did it alone. I sometimes wonder what his life was like, knowing what he knew. Going to the grocery store, making small talk with neighbors, pretending that the most significant truth about his world was something he could never fully articulate to another human being. We all came out of those mountains alive, all 8 of us. That's the fact we're all supposed to accept. And it's the fact that makes most people believe the story was really just a large mountain lion and an overreaction. But I know it wasn't. And sometimes, when I'm alone, late at night, I think about what Stephen wrote in that letter, about something watching and waiting to see what I do next, about the ancient world still existing in the wild places, still evaluating human beings, still making decisions about who deserves to survive. I think about whether there are other creatures like the one in the Appalachian Mountains, other guardians watching over other wilderness places. I think about whether, at some point in our lives, any of us might encounter something that doesn't fit into our scientific understanding, and whether we'll be brave enough or wise enough to respect it, rather than try to kill it or study it or explain it. I think about what Stephen learned in 40 years, that there are boundaries we need to respect, that some places belong to something older than us, that survival sometimes depends on accepting that there are truths we'll never be able to fully share with the modern world, And I think about the look in that creature's eyes on the ridge, the moment it evaluated us and decided we were worth letting live. I think about that choice, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm deeply, deeply aware that we survived not because we were powerful or clever or prepared. We survived because something ancient and intelligent and utterly alien to our modern understanding chose to let us survive. The mountains are still there. The creature, I assume, is still there too. Still watching, still evaluating, still maintaining a balance we can barely comprehend. And we're all just trying to live our lives knowing that, somewhere in the wild places of America, there are things still waiting, still deciding, still ensuring that humanity doesn't take over every inch of this land without respecting what came before. That's my story. That's what happened in the Appalachian Mountains in October, when 8 of us went hiking, and something very, very old took notice. That's what I need people to know, even if they don't believe me, even if they think it's just a story about a large cat and a group of spooked hikers. That's the truth of what I encountered, and the truth is that I'll never be able to fully explain it, and I've finally made peace with that. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some truths are meant to stay hidden in the wild places where they belong. And some experiences change you permanently, not because they're explainable, but precisely because they're not. There's a silence that follows certain events, the kind that settles into your chest and refuses to leave no matter how many years pass. I've carried that silence for 3 years now, and every time someone asks me why I don't go camping anymore, I find myself unable to explain. How do you tell people that something is wrong with the Cumberland Mountains? How do you describe an experience when half of it doesn't make logical sense? My name is Jonathan Scott. I'm a wildlife specialist, not a storyteller, so I'll keep this direct. In October of 2021, I led a backcountry expedition into the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was supposed to be routine, a 5-day hiking trip through some of the most remote terrain in eastern Kentucky, tracking white-tailed deer migration patterns for a conservation group. I've done this work for 11 years. I've spent more nights in Appalachian wilderness than I have in my own home. I brought 3 other men with me. Larry Torres was my primary research assistant, a meticulous note-keeper, and the best ranger I've ever worked with. Justin Nguyen was a graduate student from the University of Kentucky, bright but untested in serious backcountry work. Scott Hill was along as a videographer and general documentation specialist. The 4 of us made for a competent team. We started from a trailhead near the town of Stanton, Kentucky. The weather report had shown clear skies for the entire week. The elevation would reach about 1,200 feet at its highest points, nothing extreme. We had satellite communicators, maps, GPS units, and enough provisions for 10 days if we needed them. We were as prepared as anyone can be for 5 days in the wilderness. What I'm about to describe isn't a ghost story. It's not folklore, despite what the locals in Stanton seemed to be hinting at when we bought supplies. It's an account of something that happened, something that the 4 of us experienced together, and something that changed how I understand the world I work in. On the first night, we made camp in a clearing about 8 miles from the trailhead, near Rockcastle River. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies full of stars, the kind of October night that makes you remember why you love this work. We set up camp at dusk, prepared our meals, and settled into the routine of trail life. By 9 o'clock, all 4 of us were in our tents. I was reading by headlamp when I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite. It was small and precise, like something thin moving through the underbrush, not a deer, which moves with a certain heaviness and breaks twigs loudly. Not a raccoon, which makes a particular shuffling sound. This was something lighter, more deliberate. I turned off my headlamp and listened. The sound stopped immediately. In the silence that followed, I heard Larry moving in his tent next to mine, heard the rustle of his sleeping bag. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said. "Probably just a possum or something small. Happens all the time." But it wasn't like all the times. Something about that sound had a wrong quality to it. I've spent enough time in the backcountry to develop an instinct about these things, a sense of what belongs and what doesn't. I didn't fall asleep until well after midnight. On the second day, we hiked deeper into the forest, moving northeast toward a ridge system that would give us good vantage points for our research. The trail here was less established. We were essentially bushwhacking through old-growth forest, marking our path as we went. It was excellent terrain for what we were trying to document. We saw recent deer sign everywhere, droppings, bent branches, worn paths. Justin was in good spirits, eager and energetic. Scott Hill had his camera up most of the time, documenting the landscape. Larry stayed beside me, checking coordinates and making notes in his field journal. We were covering good ground. Around 3 in the afternoon, we found something odd. It was about 200 yards off our planned route, hanging from a low branch of a hemlock tree. At first I thought it was some kind of roadkill that had gotten tangled up there, an old hunter's trophy or something equally grim. But as we got closer, I realized what we were actually looking at. It was a small animal, no bigger than a rabbit. Its body was completely covered in gray fur, matted with what looked like blood. But that wasn't the strange part. What made all 4 of us stop and stare was its tail. The tail was impossibly long, easily 4 feet in length, and it was striped in rings of gray and black. It extended down from the low branch like a rope, swaying slightly in the wind even though there was no wind in that moment. "What the hell is that?" Scott said, bringing his camera up. I stepped forward and examined it more carefully. The animal's body was partially decomposed, but not too far gone. I'd estimate it had been dead for maybe 2 weeks, possibly longer. But I couldn't identify the species. The proportions were all wrong. The legs were too short and too thin, the claws too prominent. The head was unusual, with a long snout and teeth that seemed slightly too large. "I don't know," I said. "Something unusual." "It's a possum," Justin offered. "A weird-looking one, but—" "No," I said. "No, possums don't have tails like this. And the claws are wrong. The whole structure is wrong." Larry was taking photographs. He didn't say anything, just documented what we were seeing. I took several close-up photos myself, thinking that maybe if I showed them to other wildlife specialists, someone could identify what this was. The smell started bothering me after a few minutes. I suggested we move on. None of us wanted to spend extra time studying the corpse. As we walked away, I heard Justin say to Scott, "That was definitely weird." Scott didn't respond. He was watching the trail ahead of us, his jaw tight. I noticed it then. Larry and Scott both had the same expression. They'd seen something in that animal that bothered them the same way it bothered me, but none of us were going to say it directly. We made camp that night on a ridge overlooking a valley. The sky was clear again, but the temperature had dropped. It was probably in the low 40s by the time we had our tents set up. We ate a quiet dinner. The mood had shifted somehow. The animal we'd found had cast a shadow over the day that didn't quite dispel. I was in my tent by 8:30, earlier than the previous night. I needed to be alone, I think. Or maybe I needed to not be alone, I still don't know. The sound came around 11 o'clock. This time it was louder, more distinct. It was the sound of something moving through the brush, but with an odd quality I couldn't quite place. There was a dragging component to it, as if something was being pulled across the forest floor. It came from the north side of our camp, moved east, then disappeared. I heard Larry and Scott talking in hushed voices. I got up and unzipped my tent. The moon was bright enough to see the camp clearly. Justin was standing near the fire pit, looking out into the darkness. "We should organize a watch schedule," Scott said. He wasn't asking. He was stating it. We did. I took the first watch from midnight to 2 Larry took 2 to 4. Justin would take 4 to 6, and Scott would finish from 6 to 8. It seemed excessive, but no one objected. The watch hours that night were the longest of my life. I sat by the fire, feeding it small amounts of wood, keeping it at a level that would give me good visibility around the camp without being so bright that it destroyed my night vision. I kept a flashlight in my lap. Nothing came close to the camp, but I could hear movement in the forest surrounding us. Lots of it. Small, quick movements, circling sounds. Once, I heard something that almost sounded like a cry, but not quite like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was high-pitched and sudden, cut off abruptly. When Larry came out at 2 o'clock to relieve me, he looked exhausted already. "Anything?" he asked. "Movement," I said. "Lots of it." But nothing approached the camp. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. We didn't discuss the dead animal again, but it was the only thing any of us were thinking about. I was sure of it. The third day of our expedition was the day everything began to crystallize into something beyond mere strangeness. We broke camp at dawn, planning to continue northeast toward our planned research sites. The morning was cold, our breath visible in the mountain air. We moved slowly, more cautiously than we had the day before. It took me about 3 hours to notice something I should have seen immediately. Our trail markers were gone. We'd been following a route we'd marked with bright orange flagging tape attached to trees at regular intervals. It was a standard practice, ensuring we could find our way back out if needed. But starting from around midday, the markers simply weren't there. We found the last one at approximately 11 in the morning, nailed to an oak about 2 feet up from the ground. After that, nothing. "Maybe we've moved beyond the marked section," Justin suggested. He was trying to be reasonable, trying to apply logic to a situation that was becoming increasingly difficult to explain logically. But that didn't make sense. We'd marked our entire planned route for the entire expedition, all of it. There were supposed to be orange flags every 100 yards or so. They couldn't all simply be gone. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked our coordinates. My stomach tightened. We were about 2 miles off our intended position. We'd somehow drifted nearly due west when we were supposed to be moving northeast. That shouldn't have been possible. I had a compass. Larry had a compass. We were both experienced at navigation. We weren't the type of people who got lost in the woods. And yet here we were, verifiably lost. "Okay," I said calmly. "Here's what we're doing. We're going to maintain our current position, reorient, and head back toward our last marked location. Then we can plan from there." Nobody objected, but I could see the tension in their bodies, especially in Scott's face. He'd lived in Kentucky his whole life. He knew these mountains, and he knew that things like this didn't happen to people like us. The walk back to our last marker took an hour and a half. It shouldn't have taken that long. The distance was roughly a mile. But the terrain had gotten significantly rougher. We were moving through dense underbrush, climbing over rocky outcrops, navigating around fallen trees. It was slow going. When we reached the marker, I immediately took a new bearing and checked our equipment. Everything was functioning correctly. My GPS was showing the right coordinates. My compass was pointing true north. "We're going back to camp," I announced. "But we're only 3 days in," Justin protested weakly. "We haven't completed. We're going back to camp," I repeated. "We can reassess from there." Larry started dismantling our supplies. Scott helped without being asked. We left behind some of our equipment, extra food, some video gear to lighten our load. If we were going to move faster, we needed to be as unencumbered as possible. It took us 6 hours to return to our previous night's camp. We should have reached it in 3. The terrain seemed different somehow, altered. Passages that should have been open were blocked with fallen trees. Landmarks that should have guided us seemed to have relocated. Twice, we came to places that looked vaguely familiar but definitely weren't where I remembered them being. By the time we collapsed into camp, all of us were exhausted and deeply unsettled. I built a fire immediately, larger this time. I wanted light, as much light as I could get. It was still a couple hours until sunset, but I didn't care. Light felt like safety. "What's happening?" Justin asked. His voice was very small. Nobody answered because none of us had a good answer. I could construct explanations: unusual magnetic declination, faulty equipment, simple navigation errors, but none of them felt true. They felt like lies I was telling myself to maintain a grip on rational understanding of the world. "We're leaving in the morning," Scott said. "We're hiking out, all the way out." Nobody disagreed. As evening fell and we prepared dinner, I made a decision. I pulled out my SATCOM unit and called in our status report to our point of contact, a conservation officer named Brandon Flores who was monitoring our expedition from his office in Lexington. This was standard procedure. We were supposed to check in every other day. "Everything okay?" Brandon asked immediately. He could hear something in my voice, some wavering at the edge of professional calm. "We're fine," I said carefully, "but we're going to cut the expedition short. We're heading out tomorrow morning." "What's wrong?" I thought about that question for a good 30 seconds. How do you explain to someone in a warm office in a town that what you're experiencing in the wilderness doesn't quite fit into comprehensible categories? "Navigation issues," I said finally. "Possible equipment malfunction. Better safe than sorry." "Okay," Brandon said. "Keep me updated. And Jonathan, be careful out there. That area has a lot of old folklore attached to it. Probably nothing to worry about, but the locals in Stanton mentioned some stories when you gassed up. Just thought you should know." My mouth went dry. "What kind of stories?" "The usual mountain stuff," he said. "Creatures in the forest. Most of it is nonsense, but you know how people are. There's an old legend about something called the Talipo. Supposed to be a monster of some kind. A few hikers have reported strange experiences in that area over the years, probably just coincidence, but I figured I should mention it. After I signed off, I didn't tell the others what Brandon had said. I told myself it was because I didn't want to panic them further, but really, it was because hearing the word Talipo spoken out loud made something inside me lock up with a fear I couldn't quite articulate. That night, we attempted the watch schedule again, but nobody could sleep. All 4 of us were awake by 9 o'clock, sitting around the fire, saying very little. The sounds from the forest were louder now, more frequent. They came from all directions, circling the camp in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that froze my blood. It was a voice. Not quite human, but following human patterns of speech. It didn't form words exactly, it was more like the attempt to form words, the shape of language without the substance. It came from the north side of camp, from the darkness beyond our fire. All 4 of us heard it. I saw it register on their faces, a moment of recognition that we were all experiencing the same impossible thing. "What the fuck was that?" Justin whispered. Nobody answered. The sounds continued at intervals throughout the night, always from the periphery of our fire's light, always indistinct enough that I could almost convince myself I'd misheard. But I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard. When dawn came, it felt like the sun was arriving to rescue us from something we couldn't quite name. We started hiking out at first light. No breakfast, no slow preparation. We simply gathered our essential gear and moved. The idea was to cover the 8 miles back to the trailhead in one day, moving as quickly as possible on terrain we'd already covered. It should have been manageable. It wasn't. The forest seemed actively opposed to our departure. Fallen trees blocked our path with regularity that felt deliberate. Streams that should have been easy to cross were swollen and difficult. The weather, which had been clear and cold, turned gray and damp. A mist settled through the trees that made it difficult to see more than 50 yards ahead. By noon, I realized we'd made terrible time. We'd covered maybe 2 miles, and the terrain was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. I was checking the GPS constantly, but it kept showing the same thing. We were moving in the wrong direction. Not slowly in the wrong direction, we were actively moving away from the trailhead, deeper into the mountains. "This isn't right," I said to Larry. We were walking side by side, both watching the GPS units in our hands. "Both units are showing the same thing. We're going northeast when we should be going west." "The compass is broken," Larry said quietly. "I checked it again this morning. The needle won't settle. It keeps spinning." A broken compass could be explained. Electromagnetic phenomena, mineral deposits in the rock, solar activity. But 2 GPS units, both malfunctioning in the same way. The probability approached 0. "We're going to stop," I announced. "We need to regroup." We found a small clearing and established a temporary camp. Nothing fancy, just a place to sit and think. As the 4 of us gathered around, I could see that the facade of calm was slipping away. Scott's hands were shaking. Justin looked like he might be sick. Larry was very, very still. "Something is wrong with this forest," Scott said. It wasn't a question. "That's not logical," I said. And even as I was saying it, I knew how stupid I sounded. Logic had left us behind somewhere in the last 36 hours. "I don't care," Scott said. "I grew up in these mountains. I know them. This doesn't feel right. The geometry is wrong. The trees are in the wrong places. And we've been walking for hours and we're farther away from where we started, not closer. That's not possible, but it's happening." I couldn't argue with him because he was right. The evidence was there in the GPS readings, in the broken compass, in the slow mathematical certainty that we were being pushed deeper into terrain that seemed actively antagonistic to our escape. "Maybe we should rest," Justin suggested. "Maybe when we're less tired, we'll be able to." That's when we heard it. It was much closer than it had ever been, close enough that we could hear it clearly. It was the thing that had been circling our camps, the presence that had been following us. And this time, it wasn't attempting language. It was simply making a sound. It was a cry of hunger. I don't have another way to describe it. It was a sustained, high-pitched sound that seemed to express want and frustration and something else, something ancient and alien. It came from the forest north of our position, maybe 200 yards away, hidden in the mist and the trees. We all scrambled to our feet. Panic was starting to override training and protocol. I could see it in how Justin moved, in how Scott had his hand on his knife, in how Larry was backing slowly toward the center of our group. "Pack everything," I said. "We're moving, now." We threw our gear together as quickly as we could. The cry came again, from a different direction this time. It was hurting us. I understood that with a clarity that made my legs shake. Whatever this was, it was intelligent enough to chase us in a way that forced us in a specific direction. We were heading northeast again, deeper into the mountains, exactly where it seemed to want us to go. I made a command decision that I've questioned every day since. I pulled out my machete and marked a tree with a deep, deliberate slash across the bark, a signal. Then I pointed us due west, the opposite direction from where the cries had come from. "We go this way," I said, "no matter what. We force a line due west and we don't deviate. We move through that forest like people being chased, because we were being chased." Behind us, I could hear the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. Not crashing blindly, it moved with purpose and intelligence, following our trail. The mist grew thicker. At one point, I could barely see the trees 5 feet ahead of me. We were moving by compass alone, following the direction the needle pointed, ignoring the pulling sensation that tried to redirect us northeast, the whispers that came from that direction, the sounds of movement that seemed to want to catch our attention. It was during this desperate flight that I saw it. It was only for a moment. The mist parted, and there was something standing between 2 large hemlocks about 30 yards to our north. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. There was something vaguely feline about its shape, lean and predatory, but the proportions were wrong. The tail was extraordinarily long, striped in rings of gray and black, swaying like a hypnotist's watch. The head was small, almost delicate, with a long snout filled with teeth that looked far too large. Its eyes found mine. I've spent most of my life around animals. I understand predation, understand the look of a creature hunting, but this was different. This was intelligence behind that gaze. Curiosity. Hunger, yes, but also something that felt disturbingly like amusement. Then the mist closed around it, and it was gone. I didn't stop moving. I couldn't stop moving. Behind me, I heard Justin cry out a short, sharp sound of pain or terror, but when I turned to look, he was still there, still moving, still following. The cry had come from somewhere else, another direction. More than one thing was moving through the forest with us. We moved like this for hours. I have no accurate sense of how long. Time became very elastic. It felt both eternal and compressed. The mist never lifted. The forest never changed. We simply walked through a nightmare landscape toward a destination I couldn't see and wasn't sure actually existed. Then, as suddenly as it had began, the assault stopped. The sounds ceased. The mist started to lift. The terrain began to look familiar again, and with a shock of recognition that made my legs nearly buckle, I saw an orange flag tied to a tree, our marker, the one we'd placed 5 days ago as we entered the forest. We walked the final mile to the trailhead in a state that barely qualified as consciousness. The parking area was exactly as we'd left it. Our vehicle was there, untouched. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that felt obscene in their beauty. We made it to town in silence. None of us spoke. We drove to the nearest hospital in Lexington, but our request for medical attention was confusing to the staff. We had no visible injuries. When they asked what had happened, none of us could explain. We were released, after observation, with a psychiatric referral that none of us pursued. It's been 3 years. I never wrote up the results of that expedition. The conservation group I was working with did send someone to follow up, to understand why we'd abandoned the work halfway through. I told them there were safety concerns, equipment failure, nothing more. They accepted it, if with some reluctance. I haven't returned to that forest. I turned down a very lucrative contract last year that would have involved work in those same mountains. I couldn't do it. Larry Torres left the research field entirely. He works in wildlife rehabilitation now, indoors, with animals that have already been captured and contained. I ran into him once at a grocery store in Lexington, about a year after the expedition. We didn't acknowledge each other, just a small nod of recognition. The look in his eyes was the same thing that I feel in my own chest every day, the weight of something witnessed, but not explainable. Justin Nguyen did finish his degree. I heard he's working in California now, in a different field entirely. He never returned my calls after we got back. Scott Hill was the one I kept the most contact with. We'd grab coffee occasionally, and we did talk about it, but even between the two of us, we couldn't construct a coherent narrative. What we had instead was a collection of details, the smell, the sounds, the geometric wrongness of the forest, the eyes of the thing we glimpsed that didn't quite form a complete story. 3 months ago, Scott called me. I hadn't heard from him in almost a year. I found something, he said. His voice was urgent, excited, but also afraid. I've been researching what we saw. The creature. There's actually historical documentation of it. There's a researcher who studied Appalachian folklore for decades. He wrote about sightings of something that matches what we encountered. He sent me a document. It was an academic paper about the Talipo legend. According to the research, the creature was supposedly a cat-like animal, probably now extinct, that once inhabited the eastern mountains. It was sometimes described as malevolent, sometimes as merely territorial. The few surviving accounts suggested it was highly intelligent and seemed to harbor an unusual hatred toward human beings. Most accounts ended the same way. People who encountered it didn't leave the mountains alive, or if they did, they left changed. Trauma, madness, an inability to describe what had happened. But there was one account, from a man named Harlan Garrett in 1953, that was different. Garrett claimed to have encountered the creature while lost in Cumberland National Forest. He managed to escape, but in his account he mentioned something curious. He said the creature was hunting him, yes, but it was also trying to guide him, that it was herding him towards something, a destination. He described its behavior as predatory, but also purposeful. And in the moment before he managed to escape and find his way out of the forest, he saw what it had been trying to lead him to. He wouldn't say what it was. "Do you think that's what happened to us?" Scott asked. "Do you think it was trying to lead us somewhere?" "I don't know. I've thought about it extensively. I've replayed that moment when I saw its eyes, when it seemed to look directly at me with that combination of hunger and intelligence. I've wondered if my decision to run west, to resist the pull toward the northeast, was an act of survival or an act of cowardice. Did we escape, or did we simply refuse the invitation? I still don't go into wilderness alone. I work from an office now, analyzing data collected by other people, staying as far from actual field work as I possibly can. Everyone thinks I'm afraid. Maybe that's true. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if fear is the right word for what I feel. It's something more complex. It's the knowledge that there are places in this world that operate by rules I don't understand. Places where my expertise means nothing. Places where the forest itself seems to have agency and intention. Most of all, it's the certainty that the creature never stopped following me. I've never seen it again, but I felt it. In the woods near my house, in the brush at the edge of parks, in the way shadows move differently in certain seasons. It's patient, it's intelligent, and I'm no longer entirely sure which one of us is hunter and which is hunted. Sometimes I think about calling Scott, asking if he feels it too. But I don't. Some things are better left unspoken, because speaking them makes them more real. The old legends say the Talipo remembers everyone who wrongs it. I'm not sure what we did to wrong it, but I'm certain we did something, and I'm equally certain it hasn't forgotten. Before I tell you what happened in the winter of 2019, I need to explain something about the job. Most people think being a ranger in a national park is about handing out maps and telling tourists not to feed the bears. The reality is far different. We're responsible for thousands of acres. We patrol remote areas. We respond to emergencies where there's no cell service, no backup for hours, sometimes days. We see things that never make it into the official reports, things that don't have simple explanations, things that shouldn't exist, but do. My name is James Cook. I've been a ranger at Shenandoah National Park for 11 years. I've hiked every trail, climbed every summit, and weathered every season the mountain can throw at a person. I know these ridges like I know my own face. I've led search and rescue operations. I've found lost hikers and scared away curious black bears. I've dealt with everything a wilderness can present you with, everything except what I found on the North Slope in December. This is the account of the 3 days I spent hunting something that shouldn't have been hunting in my park. This is what I saw, this is what I survived, and this is why I don't work Shenandoah anymore. The call came in at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. 2 hikers from Maryland hadn't returned to their trailhead. Their names were Daniel and Christine. A family friend had been expecting them back the previous evening. When they didn't show, he waited until morning before calling the ranger station. This wasn't unusual. Hikers get lost. They lose track of time. They take wrong turns. Usually we find them within a few hours, tired and embarrassed, their expensive hiking gear covered in mud from bushwhacking back to the trail they should have been on. By the time I was pulling on my heavy gear and checking my radio, I wasn't concerned. Annoyed, maybe. Concerned, no. My supervisor, Thomas, briefed me in the station. Daniel was 52, Christine was 49. They were experienced hikers with proper equipment. They told the friend they were doing a loop trail on the north slope, about 6 hours total. The trail was standard difficulty, well-maintained, marked clearly. They should have been out by 5, Thomas said, sipping his coffee. Maybe they stopped somewhere scenic for dinner. You know how people are. I nodded. He was right. They'd probably already hiked back to their car, discovered the friend panicking, and were on their way home with good stories about how their tracker got them worried over nothing. But protocol demanded a search. I coordinated with another ranger, Marcus, and we split the area. I took the North Slope Trail, the same route Daniel and Christine should have walked. My pack contained emergency supplies, a first aid kit, communication equipment, extra batteries, and flares. The December air was crisp, but not dangerously cold. We were weeks away from true winter. The sky was overcast, but not threatening rain. I reached the trailhead at 9 in the morning. Their car was there, a blue sedan, parked carefully in the designated lot. My stomach didn't tighten. My concern didn't elevate. I simply began walking into the forest, as I'd done hundreds of times before. The first hour of the hike was routine. The trail wound through dense forest, hemlock and oak, with occasional clearings where the view opened toward the valley. The path was dry, recently cleared of fallen branches. I saw no signs of distress, no abandoned gear, no torn clothing on branches. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. At about mile 2, I encountered the first oddity. The forest became too quiet. This might sound strange to someone who's never spent serious time in wilderness, but silence in the forest is never complete. There's always something: wind in the trees, a distant bird call, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the ambient whisper of the living world around you. This silence was different. It was absolute, dead. Like walking through a held breath. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail and listened for a full minute. Nothing. No birds. No wind. No rustling. Just the absolute absence of sound. I checked my radio. 2 bars of signal. I reported my position to Thomas. All clear so far. No signs of activity. Continuing up. Static crackled back. Copy that. Marcus is on the eastern approach. I continued walking, but the silence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. At mile 3, I found something. It was partially hidden in the ferns on the left side of the trail, a woman's hiking boot, purple. The laces were intact, tied neatly. I approached it carefully, touching nothing, and examined it from several angles. There was no foot inside it, no torn flesh, no blood. It had simply been left there, as if removed deliberately and placed beside the path. My heartbeat increased. This was real. I radioed Thomas immediately. Found one of their boots. Left side of the trail. Mile marker 3. No sign of the hiker. Copy. We're dispatching additional rangers. Stay on the trail and look for the other one. I did. I walked the next mile with my eyes on the forest floor, and at mile 4, I found a man's hiking boot. The same condition as the first, undamaged, unlaced, abandoned. What I didn't find was any sign of panic or struggle. No torn clothing, no blood, no scattered gear, just the boots, placed where they could be found, as if someone was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow. The rational part of my brain was already constructing narratives. They had stopped to rest, removed their boots, hiked barefoot to a clearing or destination nearby. Perhaps they'd found a shelter, decided the weather was too cold to continue, and were waiting to be found. Perhaps they'd gotten lost and gone off trail, unaware they were being searched for. The irrational part of my brain was screaming something different. At mile 4.5, the trail opened onto a ridge that provided a clear view toward a deep gorge. The overlook was one of the scenic stops that had probably caused Daniel and Christine to linger. I stepped out onto the exposed stone to look around. The view was magnificent, as always. Distant ridge upon ridge, fading into winter haze. The valley below, a sense of standing on top of the world, and something wrong with the forest 200 yards below me. There was a section of trees, about an acre of dense growth, where the canopy was disrupted. It looked like something had thrashed through, breaking branches, devastating the smaller growth. It was visible because the damaged area hadn't yet closed and the healing response of the forest takes time. I'd never seen that damage before. I radioed Thomas. "I'm at the ridge overlook, mile 4.5. There's significant forest damage about 200 yards northeast of the trail. Looks recent. Not typical wind or animal damage. I'm going to investigate." "Copy that. Watch yourself. Are you armed?" "No," I said. "We don't routinely carry weapons at Shenandoah." "All right. Report in every 5 minutes." I left the trail, making my way carefully down the slope toward the damaged area. The forest was steep and thick here, and I moved slowly, using trees for balance, announcing my presence loudly. If Daniel and Christine had gotten injured and limped off trail, they might be sheltering nearby, and I didn't want to accidentally startle them. "Hello, this is a ranger. Can anyone hear me?" My voice sounded small in the heavy air. I reached the damaged area and immediately understood something was wrong. Very wrong. The trees here hadn't been blown down by wind. They had been stripped. Bark had been torn away from the trunks in vertical patterns, exposing the white wood beneath. Branches had been snapped at odd angles. The smaller trees had been pushed flat, not broken, as if something heavy had walked through and trampled them. The ground was a mess of disturbed earth, though the frost and leaf litter made it hard to read any clear tracks. I stood in the center of this devastation and felt the first genuine spike of fear. Something large had been here, something with significant strength. The damage covered too large an area to be caused by a bear, even if a bear would tear bark and topple trees like this, which it wouldn't. I radioed Thomas. "I've found major disturbance in the forest. Looks like something large passed through here. Vegetation damage suggests possible predator activity or human panic. I'm looking for any sign of the missing hikers. Any blood? Any human remains?" "Negative. Just environmental destruction. Proceed with caution. Marcus is being redirected to your location. You've got about 20 minutes." I continued searching the area, moving through the destruction, looking for anything that might belong to Daniel and Christine. A piece of clothing, a backpack, a body. I found nothing, but I did find something else. Among the flattened vegetation, near what appeared to be a depression in the earth as if something large had rested there, I found several white hairs. They were long, coarse, and yellowish-white in color. I carefully placed them in a small evidence bag from my pack without touching them directly. They didn't belong to a black bear. They didn't belong to any animal I recognized. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky. I had maybe 3 hours of good light left. I radioed Thomas again and reported everything I'd found. He told me to mark the location with flagging tape and return to the main trail to meet with Marcus. Search and rescue teams would process the site more formally. As I made my way back up the slope, I realized the absolute forest silence had returned. No birds, no wind, no life. Just me and the weight of the injured forest around me. Marcus and I met back at the ridge overlook. He was a veteran ranger, maybe 15 years my senior, with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen plenty of strange things in his decades of service. When I showed him the white hairs and described the damage, he went very still. "That doesn't look like anything that should be here," he said quietly. "My exact thought. In all my years," he continued, "I've never seen forest damage like that. A bear would claw, yes, but this." He gestured down the slope. "This looks intentional, like something was angry." We marked the area thoroughly and made our way back down the trail as the light began to fail. The search for Daniel and Christine would continue tomorrow with fresh teams and better weather. Nighttime searches in unfamiliar forest were dangerous and ineffective, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in my apartment in town, scrolling through my laptop, pulling up everything I could find about large predators in the Appalachian region. Bears, of course. Mountain lions, which were technically extinct in Virginia but occasionally reported by hikers and locals. Wolves, similarly absent but present in local legend. Boars. Nothing explained the damage I'd seen or the nature of those white hairs. Around midnight, I received a call from Thomas. Daniel and Christine's cell phone records had been checked. There had been no calls or texts after they'd started their hike. No distress signals. Their last ping was from inside the park. "We're treating this as a missing persons case," Thomas said. "I'm going to assume you'll want to be part of the ongoing search." "Absolutely." The next morning, I was back on the North Slope Trail with a full team. We'd called in rangers from neighboring parks. We had search dog handlers coming in from a few hours away. We had proper forensic people, The boots had been collected as evidence. The area with the forest damage had been flagged and documented. Someone had the brilliant idea of checking recent hiker reports to see if anyone else had noted unusual activity in that section. There had been several. Over the past 3 weeks, multiple hikers had reported seeing areas of disturbed forest. One hiker from Pennsylvania had reported hearing an animal sound unlike anything I've ever heard, kind of between a howl and a human scream. Another reported finding massive indentations in the mud near the stream bed, like something walked on all fours, but the stride was impossibly long. None of these reports had been taken seriously at the time. Hikers see and hear things. Fear and imagination amplify strangers in the forest. But now, with 2 people missing, these reports took on new significance. By day 3 of the search, we'd expanded to several miles of trail. The search dogs had several false starts. One handler told me the dogs seemed unusually nervous in certain sections of the forest, reluctant to proceed despite training and encouragement. On the evening of the 3rd day, we found what appeared to be a campsite, roughly a quarter mile off the main trail. It was crude, just a cleared area beneath some rock outcropping, not actually sheltered but offering some protection from overhead. There was a dead fire pit, recently used based on the ash, and scattered around it were pieces of clothing torn in ways I had never seen before. The fabric hadn't been cut, it had been shredded, as if pulled apart by multiple strong points of pressure simultaneously. Some pieces still held bloodstains, though not enough blood was present to indicate a fatal injury. A piece of Christine's jacket was among the fragments. Daniel's backpack was there, undamaged, as if it had been removed before the violence began. There was no other sign of them. The search continued for another full week, expanding into surrounding areas, but nothing else was found. No bodies, no further remains, no clear indication of what had happened or where they had gone. Eventually, the intensity of the search had to decrease. Other resources were needed. The case remained open but inactive. I, however, could not move on. Every day of my remaining shifts, I requested the North Slope area. I walked it. I watched it. I documented everything: unusual disturbed vegetation, animal signs, strange marks on trees. I studied field guides to every predator in North America. I read reports from online forums about cryptid sightings in the Appalachian Mountains. I found myself reading increasingly obscure accounts from early settlers and frontier journals, stories that had been passed down through generations and largely dismissed as folklore. That's where I first encountered serious written descriptions of something called a Wendigo. The accounts varied, but common elements emerged. A creature of the deep wilderness, possibly humanoid, possibly bestial, possibly something that existed between categories. Known particularly to the indigenous peoples of the northern regions, the Algonquian, Cree, and surrounding nations. Described as a spirit of profound hunger, a being driven by insatiable appetite. Tall, thin, impossibly fast, known to hunt humans in remote areas during the winter months. The traditional interpretations were spiritual and cultural, stories with moral meanings about the dangers of greed and starvation. But the actual historical accounts suggested something more literal, something that physically existed, something that killed. I didn't believe in Wendigos. I'm a man of the modern world, trained in wilderness response and practical problem solving. But I also couldn't explain what I'd found, and the holes in my understanding bothered me like a persistent itch. On December 18th, exactly 2 weeks after Daniel and Christine disappeared, I received permission to do a solo patrol in the North Slope area. I told Thomas I was looking for any additional evidence. Privately, I was looking for the creature itself. I knew it sounded insane even as I contemplated it. I left the ranger station at 6 in the morning, before sunrise, with my pack fully loaded and a handheld flare gun as my only defensive tool. I had prepared as well as I could for something I didn't understand. The trail was empty of hikers. December was not peak season, and the missing persons case had scared off casual visitors. I moved quickly, reaching the campsite area by noon. I sat there for hours, waiting, watching, listening. Nothing appeared. As the sun began to set, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to go deeper into the forest, off-trail, into the undisturbed wilderness where the creature, if it existed, might have its territory. I should have walked back to the trailhead. I should have given up on the investigation and submitted to the reality that some cases simply don't have answers. Instead, I went deeper. The forest at night, even with a good flashlight, feels like a different place than the forest in daylight. Daylight gives you context. It shows you the scale of the landscape. It reveals what's near and what's far. Night strips all of that away and gives you only what your light touches, leaving everything else, which is most things, in absolute darkness. I moved carefully, stepping over fallen logs, around dense brush, staying alert for the sound of movement around me. My training told me to announce my presence, to make noise so animals would flee rather than be startled. My instinct told me to be silent, to listen, to try to hear whatever might be listening to me. I compromised and moved in heavy silence. By 9 o'clock, I'd gone roughly 2 miles into the forest without encountering anything. The cold was increasing. December nights in the mountains are serious business. I could see my breath in front of my flashlight beam. My hands were growing stiff. I was considering turning back and trying again another day when I saw the light. It was ahead of me, deeper in the forest, a light source that wasn't mine. It was reddish in color, not the white of a proper flashlight. It was moving. I immediately thought of hikers, lost hikers with a failing lantern. But the movement was wrong. It wasn't the careful stepping of a human in darkness. It was fluid, strange, almost gliding through the landscape as if the terrain didn't present the difficulties it did for me. I moved toward it, carefully, quietly. My heart was accelerating. Every survival instinct was screaming at me to retreat, but I pushed forward. The light disappeared. I waited, standing absolutely still in the darkness, my own flashlight beam cutting a small corridor of visibility in the vast black. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, from somewhere above me, I heard a sound. It was breathing, but not like any breathing I'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, with a quality like wind moving through vast passages, like a furnace drawing air, like something with a body built for consuming enormous quantities of oxygen. It was close, very close. I swung my flashlight upward and found myself looking up a slope toward a rocky outcropping, and standing on that outcropping, backlit by my own flashlight beam, was a shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, easily 8 feet or more. It was thin, with a musculature that suggested extreme leanness beneath whatever covered its frame. Its head was elongated, somehow wrong in its proportions. Its eyes reflected my light with an orange-red glow, animal eyes, predator eyes, and it was looking at me. In that moment, I understood that my understanding of what was possible had been fundamentally incomplete. This thing existed. It was real. It was here. And I had made a catastrophic mistake in seeking it out. I didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed me. Instead, I ran. I crashed backward through the forest, abandoning any attempt at careful movement, my flashlight bouncing wildly, the darkness seeming to grab at me. Behind me, I heard it following. Not running that would have implied the same desperate effort I was expending. It was moving through the forest with an easy grace, covering ground that took me panicked leaps in single, measured strides. I could hear its breathing growing closer. I could hear something else, too. A sound like vocalizations, not howling, not growling. Something that sounded almost like human speech, but stretched and distorted, delivered in a voice that came from something with lungs far larger than any human. The forest opened up suddenly into a small clearing, and I burst through into moonlight. I risked a glance behind me. I saw it emerge from the tree line, silhouetted against the lighter darkness of the open space. It stopped at the edge of the forest. I kept running, gasping, toward the direction I hoped would be back toward the trail. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were bleeding. My mind was operating in pure survival mode, stripped of any rational thought. I don't remember exactly how long I ran. 30 seconds, 3 minutes. It all blurs together in memory. But eventually, I found myself on rocky terrain. I recognized I was back near the ridge overlook where this nightmare had begun. I scrambled down the slope toward the main trail, moving in the darkness with reckless speed, taking falls I didn't register until later. I burst onto the trail and kept running until I saw the light of my ranger station vehicle at the trailhead parking lot. I had left it there, unlocked, my habit for these solo patrols. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the vehicle, slammed the door, and locked it. Then I sat there, hyperventilating, unable to do anything but gasp for air and try to stop my hands from shaking. For a full hour, I sat in that vehicle and waited. I waited to see if the thing would emerge from the forest. It didn't. The forest remained dark and still. Around midnight, I drove back to town. I didn't report anything to Thomas. I didn't file a report. I drove home in silence and sat in my apartment trying to rationalize what I had experienced. Stress-induced hallucination, hysteria triggered by fear and isolation, a bear I had misidentified in the darkness, a combination of shadow and moonlight, and my own desperate mind creating something that wasn't there. But I knew the truth. I had seen it. It was real. It was in the forest. It had taken Daniel and Christine, and it had let me go, which seemed the most terrifying aspect of the entire encounter. Why had it let me go? I didn't return to Shenandoah for 4 days. I called in sick, cited exhaustion, avoided any situation where Thomas might ask me detailed questions. But on the 4th day, I got a call that changed everything. Another hiker was missing. A solo male hiker in his early 30s had failed to return from the same North Slope area. The pattern was identical, the same trailhead, the same route. No report of distress, no evidence of accident, just absence. The response was immediate and large. We were activating everyone. The implications were clear. We had a predator issue in the park. Something was actively hunting humans. Hikers needed to be informed. Warnings needed to be issued. Thomas called me directly. I need you back, today. This is serious now. I could have said no. I could have tendered my resignation. I could have walked away and never returned to the park. I seriously contemplated all 3 options. Instead, I said yes. I arrived at the station by mid-afternoon and immediately met with Thomas and a ranger from the State Wildlife Authority named Patterson. Patterson was explaining that they suspected a large predator, probably a mountain lion, which had occasionally been reported in the region despite being officially extinct. They were organizing search parties and discussing whether they should close the park to hikers while they investigated. We're going to need search dogs tonight, Patterson said. The hiker disappeared sometime yesterday afternoon. The trail is still fresh. I'll take the first search team, I volunteered. Thomas looked at me carefully. You sure? You looked pretty rough when you called in sick. I'm fine. I need to do this. He nodded, accepting my answer, but something in his expression suggested he knew I wasn't telling him something. Rangers develop an instinct for when other rangers are hiding information. As preparations continued, I slipped away to find a moment alone. I pulled up the historical accounts of Wendigo sightings on my phone and read them again. Accounts from the 1800s described hunters encountering the creature. Most had not survived. Those who had survived spoke of a creature that was cunning, that could anticipate human behavior, that would sometimes let humans escape, only to return for them later, that would hunt with purpose. As dusk approached, I suited up for the night search. I was determined now. If I'd encountered this creature, if it was hunting in the park, then it was my responsibility to deal with it. That's what a ranger does. We protect the park. We protect the people who come to the park, even if those people don't understand the true nature of the threat. We assembled at the trailhead around 8 o'clock. Me, Marcus, Patterson, 2 search dogs with their handlers, and 4 other rangers from neighboring parks. We were armed with high-powered flashlights, radios, and flare guns. Patterson carried an actual firearm, a modified rifle that could fire tranquilizer darts or solid rounds. The goal, Patterson said, briefing us, is to establish the location of the missing hiker and any predatory activity. Do not engage any large animal. Do not take unnecessary risks. We're here to find facts, not play heroes. I listened and said nothing. We entered the forest at 8:30. The search was organized and methodical. The dogs led us along the trail, and they were clearly tracking something. Their behavior was alert, interested, but not alarmed. Whatever scent they were following, it hadn't triggered their predator warning instincts. That made me very nervous. We proceeded to the campsite where we'd found Daniel and Christine's belongings. We found nothing new there, but we continued onward, moving deeper into the forest than we had before, following the dogs into territory that hadn't been fully searched. At around 11 o'clock, one of the dogs stopped, not alert, not pointing toward something, just stopped, froze. The handler tried to coax the animal forward, but it absolutely refused to proceed. The second dog had begun to behave similarly. Both animals were exhibiting extreme stress, whining, pulling backward, straining against their handlers. The animals have sensed something, Patterson said. They're spooked. Marcus was beside me. I could feel his body tense. He could sense it too. We were in the presence of something, even if we couldn't define it. That's when I heard it. The sound was distant but carried through the forest with unnatural clarity. It was the same sound I'd heard before, the vocalizations of the creature, that terrible, stretched human speech emanating from a throat built for something far larger than a human. "What in the hell is that?" one of the younger rangers said. Before anyone could respond, the dogs went completely frantic. They weren't trying to attack or pursue, they were trying to flee. The handlers, experienced though they were struggling to maintain control. Within seconds, it became apparent the animals were essentially in panic mode. Patterson made the decision to release them, letting them bolt back toward the trail. "That's not a mountain lion," Patterson said quietly. "I don't know what that is." We heard it again. The sound, which I now understood was something like vocalization, but something else too, a resonance that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. It was coming from deeper in the forest, perhaps 300 yards ahead of us. "We're going to proceed with caution," Patterson said. "We're going to stay together. We're going to maintain communication with base." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them to run, to leave, to abandon the search and never return. But I couldn't. I had to see this through. We moved forward as a unit, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, 5 rangers and 1 wildlife official, moving towards something we had no framework for understanding. The forest opened into a larger clearing than I had encountered before. In the center of this clearing was something that would etch itself into my memory for the rest of my life. There were bones. Scattered across the ground, arranged almost deliberately, were the remains of countless animals, deer, something larger, possibly a bear, and other things that I couldn't identify. The bones were old and new, a collection spanning months or perhaps years. This was a kill site, a feeding ground, and among the bones were human remains. I saw a piece of clothing immediately recognizable as belonging to the missing male hiker. I saw fragmented bone that could only be human. And I saw something else, evidence that the creature wasn't simply hunting for food in any natural sense. The bones were arranged with intention. They were aligned in patterns. Some were stacked, some were positioned in arcs. It wasn't the random scatter of a predator's feeding area. It was something else, something intentional. "Jesus Christ," Patterson whispered. That's when Marcus grabbed my arm, hard. "There," he said, pointing. On the far side of the clearing, at the edge of the forest, something was standing. I would never be able to describe it accurately. Human language doesn't have words for what I saw. It was tall, perhaps 9 feet. It was thin, with a frame that suggested a physiology completely alien to anything I understood. Its skin or covering, in the light of our flashlights, appeared almost translucent, with a quality like skin stretched over some structure beneath. Its face, and I use that word with the understanding that it was barely analogous to a human face, was elongated, with a jaw that seemed designed for consuming enormous quantities of matter. Its eyes were that same orange-red, intelligent, and fixed directly on us. For a moment, everything froze. Then Patterson shouted something, an order or a warning, and raised his rifle. The other rangers began backing away, some fumbling for the flare guns. I couldn't move, I couldn't look away, and the creature did something I have never understood. It opened its mouth, wider than any jaw should open, and from that mouth came a sound that isn't a sound exactly. It was something that seemed to exist in a register of reality I couldn't quite perceive. It was a physical force. It was like the forest itself was screaming, like the earth was crying out. Most of the rangers collapsed, not violently. They simply dropped, as if they'd lost the ability to remain standing. Patterson, maybe because he was braced with the rifle, remained upright, but he was clearly disoriented, confused, trying to aim at a target that his mind couldn't quite process. I found myself on my knees, unable to breathe, unable to think. And then the creature did what it had done that night in the forest. It turned and melted back into the darkness. It didn't run. It didn't leap. It simply faded, as if the darkness itself was its medium. In the space of maybe 3 seconds, it was gone. "Did you see it?" Patterson was saying, his voice shaking. "Did anyone see what that was?" "Yes," Marcus said. His voice was steady. He was on his feet, not panicked. "I saw it. We got everyone up. We collected whatever remained of the missing hiker. We made our way back to the trail with military precision, no one speaking, all of us operating in some mode beyond normal shock or fear. When we reached the trailhead, Patterson got on the radio and requested immediate backup, the state police, and hazmat teams. He also, I found out later, sent a report upward suggesting the park needed to be closed immediately. The following day, the closures were implemented. The park was shut down for a Environmental assessment. Teams of people who I assumed were government officials arrived and conducted a thorough search of the area where we'd found the bones. They found nothing. No bones, no remains, no evidence of the kill site. It was as if the forest had reclaimed itself, had hidden what it was hiding. 3 days later, Thomas called me into his office. He told me I was being transferred, effective immediately. There was a need for rangers at a park out west, and my name had been recommended. The news had already been submitted to the system. What happened out there? He asked me directly. I looked at him for a long time. I don't know, I said finally, and I'm not sure I want to understand it. I left Shenandoah National Park that week. I never returned. I work in Nevada now, in desert terrain, in a landscape that couldn't be more different from the deep forests of Virginia. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound in my dreams. The vocalization, the scream, the resonance of something so completely wrong that it broke the world just by existing in it. I've never written down what I experienced. I've never reported it officially. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. I know what hunts in that forest. And I know that Daniel and Christine are not the only people who have disappeared there. There's something in the deep wilderness, something old, something hungry, something that wears the bones of what it kills like trophies in a clearing that appears and disappears at its will. If you ever hike the north slope of Shenandoah, if you find yourself alone in that forest at dusk, if you hear an animal sound that doesn't correspond to anything in the field guide you brought with you, turn back. Don't investigate. Don't be curious. Don't be brave. Because the things that truly exist in the wilderness are not the things that the world has decided are real, and some forests hold secrets that were never meant to be found. This is what I witnessed. This is what I survived. This is my account. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget it. Before I tell you what happened in the winter of 2019, I need to explain something about the job. Most people think being a ranger in a national park is about handing out maps and telling tourists not to feed the bears. The reality is far different. We're responsible for thousands of acres. We patrol remote areas. We respond to emergencies where there's no cell service, no backup for hours, sometimes days. We see things that never make it into the official reports, things that don't have simple explanations, things that shouldn't exist but do.